Hello, everyone. I'm Alla Marchenko, president of the Aurora Philosophy Institute. Our speaker this evening is once again Torrey Byles, who will be presenting the topic, Philosophy or Psychology, Embodied Realism and the Economy of Being. Over to you, Torrey.
So I'm going to speak about philosophy versus psychology, embodied realism, money, and the economy of being. So I'm going to just start off with sort of the motivation for what I'm going to speak about. And it's really about asking, what's the nature of economics? Is it a human science or a physical science? And what should its methodology be? Interpretive and historical, or natural, empirical, materialistic, like the physical sciences are? Well, I'm going to try to demonstrate that economics is not a natural science. It is a human science, and we should not be using natural science approach to investigating economics. And unfortunately, that's what most professional economists and lay people think it is. It should be a physical science. All science is generally a physical science. We're a very materialistic culture, so we think even economic science is a physical science. But I'm going to try to show you that it's not a physical science. And the problem with economic theory today has gone back for 200 years now, since the Enlightenment, and it's tried to make it a physical science when it is absolutely not a physical science. And so it's led to just complete nonsense and misunderstanding of what money is and other kinds of economic institutions are. Economic institutions are created in language through deliberation and are real because we have agreed to live according to the rules of their use. And now that last statement is what I'm going to try to unpack and show you why it's such a different kind of science than physical science. And we're going to get into the difference between philosophy and psychology, or the overlap between the two. So I'm going to talk about these sort of 5 subjects, but I'm going to kind of interrelate them. So it sort of builds from one to the next to the next. So there'll be common themes all the way through. It's not, I'm going to just talk about each one separately as if they're disconnected or something. So we'll start off with metaphysics of the real. We'll do briefly a little what institutional reality is. We'll look at theoretical versus practical knowledge. And then we'll start looking at language, psychology, and the human sciences, and then specifically psychology and economic institutions. So we're going to start off on some sort of technical metaphysical issues. So bear with me. Some of us have been talking about this in the last few Aurora Philosophy Institute discussions and presentations, and then some of you are new. So I'll just try to be brief and as clear as I can. So the basic idea of what reality is, of course, is that reality is what is there independently of what humans think about it or any other sentient being thinks about it. And now, one of the hangups that people have about what reality is it's not exclusively physical. And this has been, for thousands of years, one of the philosophical controversies. It's been a long-standing controversy about, is it just physical or is it more than physical? So what I'm going to be holding to is that reality is not only physical, but some things can be real without physically existing. And that's where we start talking about institutional reality and social facts, everything from football games and friendships to even theories about physical reality. The theory is not physical, but it is also real, just like the objects, the physical objects that the theory is about are certainly real because they physically exist. But reality is not exhausted by physical existence. So how do we unpack basically these questions about what is real and what is our knowledge about reality? How can we have knowledge about reality? And the Greeks, were one of the first civilizations to say, we can understand reality through reason. We don't have to explain, what happens in reality just as the whims of gods and goddesses. So they really started this whole idea of kind of what science can be. We can have knowledge about reality. So we have these two aspects: our epistemological aspect, which is knowledge, and then there's the ontological aspect, which is the reality. But now, don't confuse ontological reality with only physical things. There's more than, ontology can be more than physical. And one of the things to also remember is ontology and epistemology are interpenetrating and mutually defining, depending on the kind of knowledge that you're looking for. And what we have here, there's the different kinds of physics, different kinds of physical properties: Newtonian physics, thermodynamic physics, all the way to quantum physics and relativistic physics. In a sense, it's all about the same reality, physical things, but our epistemology, our specific knowledge in these kinds of these sort of classes of physical reality, they're looking at the same thing, but they come up with a completely different ontology of things in it. So, Newtonian physics talks about forces and masses and acceleration, and quantum physics talks about small little particles and that can't even be seen by the naked eye. So there's different ontologies of things in each of these perspectives on the reality. So that's the thing about representation, which is epistemology of reality. It's always under a certain aspect or another. There's no general aspect. It's always a paradigm of looking. We're looking at small spaces in quantum physics, atomic spaces. We're looking at very large spaces in relativistic physics. So suddenly the speed of light becomes an ontological component to that knowledge of very large spaces. So our knowledge, epistemology, and ontology, the things that we're knowing about, the reality that we're knowing about, sort of tie together back and forth. But there's no overall, theory of everything all in one single epistemological representation. We can't get there. We can't make an exact representation to world isomorphic representation that way. And the reason is because knowledge presumes agency of the knower. We're always moving in time. There's a temporal dimension to knowledge. It's knowledge is not fixed, and we don't really want, put it this way, since we're always moving in time, basically we're living and we're alive, and things are constantly changing. Reality is constantly, changing. We ourselves, as people seeking, as sentient beings looking to know what's happening in each situation, what's the reality, we're thinking about what's coming at us in time. We're always considering the future, and we're basing it on our memories and on our experience of the past, and that creates the need to know what to do next as the future comes, or as we move forward in time. So knowledge is presuming that we're constantly moving in time, and we want to know, what the right thing to do is. We want to intelligently respond and adapt to this reality that we're in. So action is a really key thing. There's a what you can call a pragmatic or practical action. Practical action determines what ontologies are important to us, and the epistemology that we learn, that we're seeking, the truth that we're seeking about those objects in our reality that we're trying to that we're trying to achieve some result from. So this pragmatic maxim can be said in lots of different ways. So there's a whole list of different ways of saying this. I'm referring in particular to an American philosopher, pragmatist philosopher called Charles Sanders Peirce, who lived at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. But this has been identified across cultures. So, for example, the second one down, knowledge is the beginning of action. Action is the completion of knowledge. That was 12th century Chinese soldier statesman Wang Yangming. And so this is a cultural wide point about knowledge. Knowledge always implies action. We're always trying to know because we're always in action. We're in motion. So, but you can say this pragmatic maxim in different ways. The meaning of a thought is in its consequences for action. Beliefs are not mental states. They're dispositions to behave and to act. The conceivable effects of an object are the whole of our knowledge of the object, and so on and so forth. My favorite one is Dean Martin, popular American singer in the 50s and 60s. Good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. It's the same point. We're constantly learning. We're constantly adjusting our ability to intelligently understand and therefore act in our reality based on, that's what we are doing as human beings, and that's why we continue to become a better and more knowledgeable and more adaptive to our reality as we grow up and live, as we go through time. So it's the point here is, and one of the things that's hung up philosophy for a couple of millennia is that it's so easy to just think that only the material world exists, and our minds and our knowledge about the material world are somewhere in some other realm. So it's a false dichotomy to think that the objectivity, the ontologies of our reality and our subjectivity, our epistemology of our minds are absolutely separate. They're not separate. They're, like I'm trying to say, they're interpenetrating and mutually defined, and they change according to what you're trying to do, or what area of reality you're trying to understand. And these same kind of dichotomy is oftentimes considered, idealism versus materialism, or mind versus body. But the thing is, both ideal and material factors are informing action. Whenever you're doing something, you're typically doing it with some ideas and knowledge, or some understandings of why you're doing it. You're checking groceries out at a store, and you're going through these behaviors, knowing that what you're doing, you're buying groceries at a store. So understanding and knowing and being are one and the same thing. They're not separate. So Descartes, when he said, I think, therefore I am, that's really false. Descartes and Plato both thought there were two absolutely separate realms. There was the ideal realm, and then there was the material realm. Oddly enough, they thought differently about which realm was real. Plato thought the ideal realm was reality, and the material world was like a corruption and a false sort of manifestation of the ideals, whereas Descartes thought the exact opposite. He thought, well, he didn't, he thought the material world was real, and the realm of mind was just another reality, another, realm, but they didn't connect. Well, that kind of thinking is good for, like I will get to, material science, but it's really not, it's not good for human science or psychology for that matter, or economics. So the real thing to say when you incorporate action into the reasons why you want to know something, that we're moving in time, we're always in action, that what the best way to say it is, the mode of living that I take makes for the kind of thoughts and thinking that I have. So these dichotomies, and I won't go through all of these, but I think I've already sort of mentioned them already. These are the kind of dichotomies that trouble philosophers. There's the subject, object, mind, body, idealism, materialism, epistemology, ontology. Idealists believe that only the left column, is the real side. Materialists think only the right side is reality. Metaphysical realists are both sides together are what constitute reality. And then what I'm calling, or actually some more recent cognitive scientists and philosophers like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, calling embodied realism, which is not only is both columns here real, but all conceptualization and thought is ultimately metaphorical. And based on the pragmatic maxim, it's really saying what our sensory motor bodies can perceive and do in one situation is always understood and conceived in terms of another domain of experience. I hope that you all can see that last little sentence there. So we think metaphorically. So even think things like, argument is war, or love is a journey. These are kind of metaphorical. You think of one kind of object, if you will, or arguing or in being in love, in terms of another kind of, typically a sensory, some kind of more physically understandable kind of domain, like journeying or being in war. So embodied realists really emphasize the metaphorical aspect of our knowledge and our understanding of things. So let me go a little further here now. What I want to start getting at is there's really two flavors to reality. There's kind of this there, and this comes starting to get at the difference between sort of the empirical physical science and the sort of non-physical reality that's also real. So science tries to get objective truth, but what it's really doing is, one of the things that's people tend to forget is that science really implies a community of investigators. So here's this, it's actually a famous and old, kind of an ancient story of, 6 blind men, and they, individually have some sampling of a real object that individually they can't tell what it is. But once they start communicating, they can understand that they're touching an elephant, right? So, but it's through, first of all, the community, and second of all, that they share a language, a shared background of meanings and definitions and conceptualizations, which additionally, they're not fixed definitions or fixed ideas about things. They can be modified and adjusted through continued conversation. That community and those mini samplings of some specific real ontology or reality composed of ontologies can suddenly start being synthesized and composed into a picture or to a representation and understanding of what the object is. So that's one kind of sort of one kind of knowledge and one kind of science, if you will. The other kind of science is just to the individual, his experience, it's his personal experience of reality. And that's sort of, without, well, that personal experience is their own life accumulated experience and understanding of reality. But you can't get an adequate sense of an objectivity to the same standard that that a group of investigators are going to get. That's one of the points about individual experience versus sharing individual experiences in a group. So there's these two flavors of reality. The deliberative with a group, it sort of makes up a consensus reality, and the consensus not like they're voting, but in just saying, let's make this let's make this be an elephant or something. They might, vote on defining this animal as an elephant. That's one issue, but it's really a consensus of putting together a lot of different samples and then creating, you can create whatever name you want for it. So that's the representation that they're going to make. The individual, though, is, there's subject-object, there's a subject-object sense from an individual's experience. And, in our waking life, we know, I'm in here and out there is reality, so to speak, or, we sense that way. There's an objective reality. But the real reality, there is, we can reflect on, I did this yesterday, or, or I'm in this group. Even an individual in the group is relating what, say, the other individuals are saying, and that individual is relating that conceptualization of reality to their own personal experience, and that comes out of a reflectivity. So, anyway, there's this sort of scientific approach, and then there's this inner experience. Now, let's switch over to institutional reality for a moment. Institutional reality is completely different than, say, the metaphysical, the material, scientific, and empirical approach. What happens when I'm talking about institutional reality, I'm talking about money, property, corporations, government bodies, laws and the justice system, games, social objects like parties, teaching institutions, this Zoom presentation, marriages. These are all social facts, social institutions. They're not discovered like, quantum physics is discovered. These objects are made by humans using a simple declaration. You are now married. I pronounce you man and wife. Now you are married. A bank lends money into existence. Loans create deposits. These are declarations, and now you have money and you can do things with it because other people subjectively see it, but it's still a real thing. So we declare things to exist, then we act accordingly. We commit to acting accordingly. We agree, maybe unconsciously, once we learn the ropes, we just, oh yeah, that's somebody's paying me money. I will pass over my personal private property to them according to a price we agree, so on and so forth. Now, this kind of creation of reality by verbal declaration is, like I say, the reverse of the scientific approach that I just described a moment ago. So institutional reality has this odd phenomenology. They're real, but they're only real because the community agrees that they're real. And so, and these institutions that we live by are not intrinsically physical. There may be, a headquarters building for a corporation, but that doesn't make it a corporation. A corporation is, created in law, and it may even just be a record down in the Cayman Islands or something like that. It's not necessarily physical, but they're real, because reality is more than just what physically exists. So they're epistemologically objective, but ontologically subjective. They're just mental ideas. They're just they're just in the ideal realm, you might say. So, and we only see the institution because we've learned to see them. Now, I made my slides a little long there, so it's the bottom sentence. It says the institution. We see the institution because the individual has learned to see it that way. We learn that way. We learn institutional reality, but it's real. It's not just it comes out of the imagination, but because everybody agrees to it, we make it real. So this starts getting at two different things. Like I said, there's two sort of flavors of reality. Again, starting from the beginning, there's a physical reality, and then there's more than physical reality. But now I'm talking about, and when we consider the pragmatic maxim that all knowledge is because we want to know how to live more adaptively to our reality. So there's theoretic scientific knowledge, and then there's practical knowledge. Practical knowledge is just being able to work or to exist and be in the world effectively. So whatever situation you're in, you know kind of what to do and how to take care of it. Is social situations, you may be an athlete in a sports event, and you're very trained, and you're very capable of dribbling the ball and shooting baskets and so forth. In a technical environment, you know how to operate a Zoom conference and control who's on and that kind of thing. So there's a very practical side. And now this kind of knowledge is not necessarily scientific in the sense of we're going to take a whole bunch of samples, and then we're going to make a hypothesis, and we're going to do some logical thinking and do some induction of creating general laws of physics, and then test them and so on and so forth. No, this is just you're practicing over time, and pretty soon it becomes kind of a second nature to you. Or you have hard knocks, and you start learning. You break up so many times with somebody you're interested in, and pretty soon you start learning a better way to pursue a relationship or something like that. So practical knowledge is what Aristotle and of course even Adam Smith wrote a big book about it. It's called prudence. Just being able to prudent. They maybe it's kind of an old-fashioned word, but being able to assess the situation, and from your own individual personal experience, kind of know how to deal with it. Some people are better than others in certain domains, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that there's some kind of universal knowledge like we might think of in the scientific realm. It's just it's your own practical ability and practical knowledge. But we've been in this culture, the modern culture, it's gotten very scientistic. We've adopted this scientism attitude, which is the mistaken belief that only theoretical scientific knowledge is genuine knowledge, and anything else is, we're just operating, on thin air, thin ice. So, but that's false. And again, this is why we want to study economics and institutions, not from a physical standpoint, but from an interpretive standpoint and a historical standpoint. And psychology is the same way. And the reason why our scientism has prevented us from getting at the human sciences, including psychology and economics, is that the scientific method doesn't really work for that, because there's no physical objects that are easy to manipulate. There's no sort of ready-made subject object clean difference that even though it's not truly real, well, you know, it's easy to be subject object and develop good theories and you know, laws of nature and stuff from looking at using the scientific method to look at physical reality. But for non-physical reality, somewhat that which is going on inside people, we don't have any sensory input. There's no empiricism per se. Yes, there's neurological, there's empirical on the you know, sensational sensory things we can monitor at the neurological level. There's also behavioral patterns that we can observe, a third party or you know, a second party can observe on another end of that, and that can be considered psychology. But the core psychology is we want to know what is going on inside the person, the inner life of the person. And although there's no empirical data for that, we know that it's there because we have one too. So we have to rely on empathy and communication to understand another. That's one point. But I'm just getting a little bit ahead of myself. I'll get back to this. We know it's an important point that psychology starts to look at that inner dimension. And, you know, at the height of the scientific revolution, there were a lot of, you know, objectors, people who objected to this complete adherence to the empirical method and rationality and reason. Reason explains everything, because they started to look at a new way of a new metaphysical approach, basically the metaphysical realist approach that I was talking about earlier. And that's different from Descartes and Kant, who sort of solidified the subject-object approach to knowledge, the very separate realms of subject and object. And so what happened when these people who started objecting, and I'm talking about Jean-Baptiste Vico, Johann Herder, Alexander von Humboldt, Soren Kierkegaard, Goethe. So those are some of the people who started looking this different way and trying to understand what human science is about. And one of the first things they started seeing was language, that language is an important component. It's a thing in itself. It's an object that helps us objectify, helps us ontologize any kind of theory that we want to understand. Or, you know, every theory has its own ontology. So, but we only start saying those kinds of things in language. And in fact, it's very closely related to this new science. This is what Jean-Baptiste Vico called it, a new science of psychology, human science, and social institutions. So what is psychology from this perspective? It's a way of reflection. This is the term that Johann Herder, German philosopher, used. It's a reflection, interior reflection. Now, the thing to make a science of psychology, anthropomorphism is the core principle, which is the exact opposite of the scientific. You want to get, you know, anthropomorphism in science is where you're starting to project onto, you know, things you know, a tree grows because it's like a human being who you know, wants to show himself. You know, it starts, you put on biases when you anthropomorphize onto physical nature. But when you're trying to understand another human being, you have to do it based on the fact that, you know, you have an inner life too. And so you're starting to relate to that inner life of the other person. So you have to understand the other person in terms of your own self-understanding. So, and so this is the beginning of psychology. Psychology begins in reflection. James Hillman, who's a 20th century psychologist, you know, philosophy starts looking at general understandings of, you know, the mind or causation or, you know, these sort of general definitions, again, from kind of a subject-object, you know, absolute subject-object split. whereas psychology is seeking to know the self and the inner life of a person. And way back before Socrates, even Heraclitus in the Greek tradition said a great thing that was, our internal life is endlessly deep. You will never find the end of the soul, for its corridors go on forever. So our internal life is endlessly deep. We can continue to penetrate and go to ever greater levels of self-understanding. So psyche logos, which is the two Greek words that means the speech of the soul. And the soul, again, it's not a physical thing, rather, it's not a substance, it's a perspective, a viewpoint toward things rather than a thing in itself. It's the meaningfulness that each of us have about, our being in the world. Whatever meaningfulness we have or lack, is our soul. And you turn, our experiences into, or things that happen to us into meaningful experiences. We are soulful when we're really in love. We are soulful as we could we're trying to understand, ourselves in terms of a religious dimension. This is what soul is. So it's their individual meaninglessness. Now, it's careful to distinguish between, say, soul and spirit, or theology, and soul as just pure internal thoughts that can be completely, delusional, or you don't even think that there's an external world. You're just all in there's a pathological place that you become if you are completely, it's called solipsism and skepticism, Humean skepticism. How do we know we're just not, in a sensory deprivation tank with electrodes tied to us, and all the sensory, we're given these, artificial worlds, and we think that we live in that. That's a skeptical viewpoint. Soul is in between the very absolute and rigid truths of science and theology, and this very skeptical, solipsistic place of the individual. So it's sort of in between. It's a mid-level place. And remember, though, laws of nature discovered by science still are only beliefs. There's no strict determinism. This is a long time kind of debate. But really, as things are changing at one minute to the next, one moment to the next, you can understand it as the next moment is really a conditional probability matrix. Or really, it's just radically uncertain, as John Maynard Keynes said. And there's multiple perspectives and paradigms really about the same reality, which are true. Again, quantum physics to Newtonian physics, they're all true and to some sense irrefutable, even though they're sort of describing different parts of reality. So the point is, there's no absolute objectivity. There's only intersubjectivity, the community and the paradigm that people live by, the consensus reality. And then there's the very individual subjectivity, which can even be unrealistic and delusional. It means the universe is open. The arrow of time is continually bringing new possibilities. So, science is only how humans interpret aspects of reality and infer beliefs about reality, or infer beliefs about those aspects and perspectives. And they're always subject to future revision, or even transcending an older, knowledge, like the Ptolemaic system of, the Earth being the center of the universe, to a more inclusive theory, which, now the Earth is orbiting the sun. We can dispel old paradigms. The old paradigms had some functionality. They allowed us to predict things to some extent, but the newer, better theory, it was even had much more far-ranging effects on what we could do. We could predict the movement of the tide. We could predict how cannonballs came out of cannons, and so on and so forth. So, whoops. Really, our knowingness, in a sense, is almost, you can call it fantasy, or you can call it a projection of our imagination. And as James Hillman says, truths are the fictions of the rational, while fictions are the truths of the imaginal. So that's a real brain twister to think about for a while. Now, we've talked about sort of psychology and being able to, anthropomorphize another person's inner life. But then there's that component of language, which is also an important component in empirical science too. So, but language it's important in psychology, because if you look at the evolutionary development of the human race, language really gave rise to a sense of individuality. And in effect, I think that's what we're kind of discovering in a very long-term view of the development of humanity, as we've gotten better and better. We're starting to understand the impact of language and the ability to speak with each other. And there's a lot of effects of that. But one of them is it's given this the effect of sensing ourselves as an individual being, whereas earlier times we were unaware, we were unconscious of language is doing that, and there was much more of a communal sense of human to the individual, of human existence. We didn't necessarily feel like we stood out so much. We were part of the family unit, the community, the local community that we grew up in, and language is just sort of a peripheral thing. We didn't realize that we started having, we our own unique personality, so on and so forth. But the other thing that language did, I'm still on that first point, is that with reflection, we're no longer, when we reflect on our life, or we reflect on how we relate to somebody else, we're no longer just acting instinctively or compulsively from our, raw hormones and flight and fight and kind of reactions. But now we can start reflecting and start acting out of reason. And this kind of gets at Aristotelian 4 ideas of what causation is. The first 2 are material and efficient, and that's more like a one force on another force causing something to happen. That's a very that's a very materialistic view of how things change. To a more the other 2 kinds of causation is the formal and the final, which is really, now you have an epistemology or more of a knowledge and a goal, and you're thinking, I want to do this, so how do I get there? So language starts getting people out of, not only it gets individualism started, but it also gets us away from just primitive reactivity to much more reasonable understanding of ourselves. It also is about community coordination, making knowledge through scientific, because we have to communicate. And remember, thinking is different from consciousness. To think about something is not to think about everything else. And language is a tool for doing that kind of thinking. And it's not just indicating reality like the 18th century scientists kept wanting to say that it was. Hobbes and Locke, these guys didn't want to have any kind of metaphors. They made just a strict, one-to-one isomorphism in your theories. That's because they thought language was just about pointing out something and describing it correctly, And that was knowledge. But language also constitutes things. And this is where this is how it makes institutional reality. We declare things to exist, and then we act accordingly. We're going to have this money system, and then we figure out how to do our finances, buy and sell and borrow and lend, employ people, be an employee, that kind of thing. It also allows us to reflect on our own personal interior lives. So we take, we learn language and the rest of the culture, and it's through this that we understand our reality, including physical reality as well as the non-physical reality. And so as we are growing in our life, we learn these things as if they're truth events, insights, epiphanies, aha moments, intuitions. They're not simply epistemological, as if we're just learning new statements, new theories. They're at the same time that we're learning these things, we're also changing. We're changing our own ontology. Our constitution as humans and the ability to act from reason, changes. We're different people than we were before we learned something. And so again, as I've been saying, subject and object, epistemology and ontology are mutually defining and interpenetrating. And this is something that 20th century psychologist Piaget did a lot of work on, and you can see that in his work. So, and again, learning to the individual as well as the society happens in events in time, and that's otherwise known as history. So knowing and being are one and the same. This is one of the insights of Heidegger. And knowing and being are one and the same. And this is why Heidegger, reversed the Cartesian maxim, not cogito ergo sum, but sum ergo cogito. And I like the Latin of, quo modo vivere ergo quo modo cogito. In other words, the style of living, therefore the style of thinking. So the style of acting informs your style of thinking, just like your style of thinking informs your acting. It's sort of both. It's an identity kind of thing. Okay, so now this knowing and being and is as being one and the same, and that you can't separate it, is basically metaphysical realism and embodied realism. And you find that in recent philosophy, existential philosophy, archetypal psychology, and then second generation cognitive psychology. First generation was a cognitive psychology that was more formed by the analytic philosophy of Anglo-Saxon philosophy. And second generation cognitive psychology is some of these people you see on the screen here: Peirce, William James, John Dewey, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jean Piaget, and Lakoff and Johnson, who I said before. So the implications, as I said in earlier talks, and some of you hadn't seen those talks, but we have not only an economic crisis, but we have a crisis in economics. We have a crisis in economic theory. It tries to use the physical science methodology to understand this domain of human science, which is ultimately understood only historically and interpretively. And so we're applying the wrong methodology to this area, and we're coming up with these really bogus and sort of nonsensical ideas like money must be a commodity and so on and so forth. There's a money supply, so on and so forth. And all the concepts around production functions and productivity are completely misconceived. And that's a whole topic for another talk. So when we use this wrong methodology, we completely miss how institutional reality comes into being. We just assume that it exists, But that's really important, and because we can change institutional reality with lots of different ways. I mean, and we've been doing that for the last 40 years, particularly about financial deregulation. And now it's become very easy to make sort of what's called, non-earned income. It's easier to make non-earned income, capital gains, profits, interest, royalties, all these different ways. It's a lot easier to make money that way than just to work, sell your labor on the market. So how we can change institutions to provide different outcomes than what's happening now. And that's totally off the radar of mainstream economics today, economic theory today. And we've become wedded to this neoliberalism, which has a totally false view of human psychology, utilitarian kind of psychology. We're absolutely separate individuals, billiard balls, atomistic people. There's no such thing as society, like Margaret Thatcher and Hayek said. Government and law are just unnatural, even though there's American ideologists on the right wing who call it natural law. It's totally inverse of what the Greeks and Romans and the medieval scholastics thought was natural law. And that law and government are totally restrictive to our individual rights for free action. And we're just nothing but hedonistic pleasure machines, strategically using each other for our own personal gratification. This is what we've got in terms of economic theory today. So in concluding, I'll leave you with these aphorisms. Jürgen Habermas, 1971, the attempt to disavow reflection is the root of positivism. Positivism is another variant of the empirical, materialist, scientific approach to truth and knowledge. Few philosophical movements can have had anything as great an influence on the mainstream economics profession as that of logical positivism from the 1930s until quite recently. And he said that. Hilary Putnam, another philosopher, said that in 2012. Instead of having a market economy, we simply are a market society. This is Michael Sandel, teaches political philosophy in Harvard. Psychology begins in reflection, as I said before, James Hillman, and then, as I said before, reflection is endlessly deep, Heraclitus. And that's it. So let me see. I think that's it. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm going to stop screen sharing and open it up to discussion. Thank you all for listening up. So are there any questions? And if you want to ask a question, go down to the bottom of your screen and click on reactions, and then it'll be a little menu that comes up and it can ask a question. So the first person I see is George. George, do you have a question?
Well, hi, and thank you very much for this introductory presentation. I'm just wondering whether we can really be so simplifying a position, for example, that economics is just a simply human science, and forget that, for example, the physical aspects of the, for example, production process, which is also another aspect of economics, a mathematical aspect of economics, which basically is there to optimize the different factors of production and satisfy, and biological aspect, which is there to satisfy biological needs and not only psychological desires. So
Yes.
it's not just a human psychological aspect, but there are actually, it's like an elephant that we presenting, like a story, the whole story about elephant, and different people from different perspectives, touching it from obviously their viewpoints, and presenting their viewpoints of the particular phenomena, which is actually sometimes much more complex, like economics in this case. And also the money has also its initial money was a commodity, and it has a physical aspects, and physical aspect of gold as a commodity is its, should I say, permanence in its appearance and physical characteristics, which gives it a good is a good candidate for a storage of value rather than just being exchanged on the market, which can other commodities can be used, like maybe some other food, but food deteriorates, degrades, etc., dries, and so on, changes very quickly.
Right, right.
So the physical aspects are actually often very important in this case because of the permanence.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying we should exclude the physical aspects. I do want to include them, but fundamentally, I'm saying it's these institutional and it's realizing that we do have these institutional realities that are not physical, and that actually it's the way we set up those institutional realities that will impact the physical side of things. So no, economics should not, discount or exclude the physical. You're right. There's a lot of math involved too, especially when you have prices and creation of money, creation of credit, I should say. And there's a lot of mathematics and finance. So I'm not saying that all of that should go away. I'm saying primarily we have an institutional economy, and how that sets up the way we physically do things and what we use physically, even as our sustenance, it has an impact on that physicality. That's all I'm saying. Ted, you look like you're next.
Yeah, sure. I think it was when you mentioned determinism and I guess the behavior of people in relation to institutions and institutions in relation to people. I started thinking about predictive analytics and the seeming ways that people can be compartmentalized into, if they have this set of understandings, then they will have this set of behaviors. And it's almost like it seems like it feels like there's choice in the system, but I sometimes wonder if there actually is, if all of economics is merely just directing you through a path that you want to be following. Do you have any opportunity or even any choice to get out of it? Are you trapped by the system that you're in? And can you really change it, especially if you've been raised to believe it's the only system possible?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's kind of, that's a long sort of debate even between sociologists and economists, who sociologists, or economists are all about choice, but sociologists are saying, well, you may be free, but you don't really have any choices to make because what's on the market is what's on the market kind of thing. But no, that's a good question. That's kind of what I would say, more than a question, it's an observation that's true. We get locked into thinking this is the one and only way to live our life. Rick.
Okay, first of all, thanks for the talk, Torrey. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great topic. And I have to admit, I took an economics course way back in the late 70s in university, and I quite enjoyed that. But I've always been arguing with my friends and people over the years that economics is a science of behavior. That's all it ever is. That's all it ever will be. I'm glad to find out someone finally agrees with me.
Good. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks. That's good. Earl.
Thank you, Torrey. I managed to copy all of your
screenshots.
Yes, screenshots. Yes, and I really appreciate that because now I have at least a vague idea of what you were talking about, and I'm wrestling with as well as I can. A couple of things that I liked was your aphorisms. Psychology begins in reflection, and reflection is endlessly deep.
Yeah.
And I think that really applies to economics.
Yeah.
The hard sciences, the physical sciences, have very strict limits that we obey every day. I'm thinking of gravity. You can't take a step or take a breath without obeying the law of gravity or it hurts. I once asked a group of conservatives, does the government have a loan limit like my credit card does? Can we say to this government, you can loan this much money? I think we're presently about 1.3 trillion in debt. Or is it possible to continue borrowing more endlessly? And I almost got lynched for asking the question. So the soft internal sciences, the problem most of us have with them most of the time is that you don't know where to start and you don't know when to stop. Gravity gives you an immediate limit. You cannot do this. The soft sciences, what can you do with that for me?
Well, you know, the soft sciences generally, I'm not going to answer all of that, but for economics, there are limits as in economics, whether you want to, well, so one of the key things that you mentioned, debt. There's a fundamental limit in economics is financial viability, whether you're a household or a private corporation now, or a bank. Now, government viability is a little bit of different beast than the other three, which are all private sector. Government is public sector, and all the borrowing that the government does ends up as income for other parties, private sector parties in the economy. So, and that's a complicated story that I'm not going to go into. In fact, how that cycle of money goes on from the government standpoint. The government has a different financial constraint condition than private parties. And those private parties I mentioned each have their own sort of sets of constraints unique to them only. Another problem with thinking that money is a physical thing like the conservatives do, and thinking that debt, there's some magical number for all participants in the economy, all agents in the economy. It's not true. There's different. It's different. It's an integrated system, each having, each playing a different role in this continued viability of the whole economy. But there is, you can generally say, the constraint of being viable, not going bankrupt, not spending more. Generally speaking, not spending more than you're taking in. Now, when you immediately, I know the conservative is going to go, well, if their taxes are low and their spending is high, they're obviously taking more in, or spending more than they're taking in, and they're not viable for at some point. But the thing is, when you have economic growth, that those bonds get paid off later, and you can get out of debt. The Clinton administration had a surplus. It was not in debt, and things like that. So, but it's a Keynesian. This is one of the great breakthroughs that John Maynard Keynes made, is to show that there's distinct types of agents in the economy that an economy where people, where it's a monetary production economy, a very important point. A society that uses money is in a monetary production economy. There's the ontology is households, corporations, banks, and government. Each one of those has unique constraints, the constraints of viability, financial viability, and they're unique. They're not, it's not a uniform thing. So it's a mistake to think, as conservatives do, that, you know, a government has to run its budget just the same way as a household. That's
my question was actually, where are the limits as soon as you put on wings and start to defy gravity? Mechanically you can do that, but in actual fact, gravity is always there. For example, there's also a lot of issues in the school system today. What should the schools teach? How much attention should they pay to small numbers of unique individuals? And again, the answer is, where do you start and when do you stop? How, if you're not talking about physical things, it's hard to find out where the limits are.
No, what I'm saying, and you mentioned, Earl, is that taking flight, for example, flight, the constraint is gravity, and you'll come back down if you're not doing. That's a good. I'll use that as a metaphor for pumping money into the economy, not necessarily by the government, you know, selling bonds, but by just banks creating loans to individuals and to corporations. That's taking flight. The bank can, where money comes from is banks create the deposits that they lend. So your mortgage, they just say you want to apply for a mortgage, you get the money is created out of nothing, and you now are spending that, and that's circulating in the economy. You have to pay that back. And I won't get into there's a efflux and a reflux as money is created and as debt is paid off. It's constantly happening in the economy. You're starting to fly. The constraint is default, is non-viability of starting a new business that doesn't get enough customers, or you're not creating enough revenue to pay off your debt and pay all the costs of production. Same thing with a mortgage, an individual, you know, you don't have an income to pay the mortgage. So you default, you go broke. The constraint, just like gravity is a constraint in the physical world, financial viability is the constraint in economics. So that's your constraint. That's my answer to your question. Now about the other human sciences, you know, I'm not going to answer that. Is that okay with you, Earl?
Well, yeah, I think you've given the best answer we can get, but the problem that I see remains. As soon as you take a step, you have to acknowledge gravity. And when you're looking inward and your inner life is bottomless, you don't know when to stop. And yeah, so a lot of conservatives are really concerned about that these days.
Well, I think you're looking for a real general kind of rule, but in that situation, I would just answer it that it comes down to what you're trying to do. You know, you're not going to just infinitely, I mean, you can infinitely look into your depths, but you're kind of, I guess you're bounded, like I was saying, by this pragmatism. You know, what are you trying to do by doing inward, in-depth, you know, and reflection. You know, and I don't know, I think maybe think along those lines and you might find some answer to your question. Off the hand, I don't know what I would say. I mean, you know, you can look at dreams and analyze dreams as sort of a form of depth. And it's kind of a fun thing to do, actually. But I think you're looking for a very general answer to something. It's a good question. So I can't quite answer it to the full extent that you're looking for. So let me answer another person's question, or try to answer another person's question. Julie. Oh, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Torrey and everyone, and thanks so much for your presentation. It definitely covered a wide range of aspects. I just recently, like how you said, gravity has constraints in the physical realm, of course, because this is our finite realm. But in the mental realm, I don't think gravity really really has much force in that realm, or the metaphysical. And then we have wings in that realm that can take us anywhere. And then also just to touch on the economic institutions, and you could look at it as a generalization just in any other sense, like society does in religion or politics. It's a mean or an average of our individual wants. Like an institution is what an average of what we as a society think is the best course of action, but it doesn't represent nearly any of our individual, it doesn't always represent the individual at all. And it can often stray far away from what all of us might want as a collective, right? Because it doesn't always represent what we really do want.
That's right. And that's kind of what I'm saying when I use that word consensus. There's like this consensus reality. It's not necessarily what any one individual wants, but we're sort of bound to this consensus. It's almost like a way we understand how to behave. It gives us order.
An ideal almost, but it isn't always ideal, is it?
Right.
It's our best guess almost. Just like philosophy is our best guess at describing something that we can't understand. The metaphysical is something that's not finite, it's infinite. It's so many possibilities.
Right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Oh, there's, we fool ourselves. We there's a lot we don't know. I mean, that's the whole thing, is we're really just the speck in the universe. We don't really know so much, and just kind of you, Julie, sort of stimulated a thought that might also answer Earl's question. I mean, one of the limits is obviously death. Dying will be a limit to how much in our lifetime, how much the individual can know, as well as death to the species might be the limit of, what we can know,
right. Where does the economic institution go after the death of our species, right?
Well, it goes with us.
Where do any of our institutions go?
No, we take them with us.
Deceased.
Okay, Frank.
Yeah, I guess a little bit what Julie is saying as well here. I was thinking, so we're talking a lot about economic behaviorism, the way I see it. So within that context, where does the notion of freedom lie?
Well, the notion of freedom lies in creating our institutions to suit our purposes. And there's a paradox. It sounds like this is a trick question now that I think about it. But I'll preface my remarks by saying, what Goethe said, that, there is no freedom without law. Now, this just makes the libertarian crazy, there, without some order, we have anarchy, and we have to, and it's really through participation with other people, engagement with other people, engagement with our reality, that we can affect what we want to do. And there's also the idea, I'm sort of, drawing on different things, but, to not recognize that we are essentially social creatures, I mean, we can be it's our sociality and our cooperativeness that allows us to produce this immense standard of living, physical and medical quality of your life. And without recognizing that, if we want to just say we can do anything we want, each individual is free to do what they want, there's not going to be any cooperative activity.
Well,
And
having said
without
that,
cooperative activity, you need some form of order and just way of engaging with each other,
okay. But having said that, Torrey, where does the artist lie, the creator?
Oh, well, yeah, I think artists are, really tying into the imaginative source of creativity, and that's actually it's creating new worlds. It's creating, which potentially can be new ways of looking at the world, or new, including new technologies, which obviously involve new practices, and new styles of living. But that's artistic, and that's artistic, it's kind of you may not think of it as an art, but somebody making a cell phone, is now we have a completely new way of living, so art is a really important part of
Mhm.
creating new possibilities for living.
Thank you.
George.
Just another contribution to the limits. Of course, it's could be taken the limits to growth. Also, the books, a series of books by the Meadow group.
Yes, yes.
And obviously the limits of the sustainable growth based on the limits of the resources. It's
Yes.
another physical aspect, should I say, of the economy that has to be taken and also optimized.
Yeah, no, I am absolutely in agreement with you. I'm not saying, again, that we want to ignore the physical side.
No, I was just contributing to the limits of the flight. Yeah, shall I say, you're taking.
But one of the things I want to say is, when we sort of try to describe an economy in sort of Newtonian terms or fluid dynamic terms, and we make these models that do that, and the fact, well, we don't recognize, we sort of misunderstand the physicality of the physical side of the economy. And that's one of our big problems today, is we're, let's say, burning down the environment. And that's going to, but from a pure market standpoint, the ideology of neoliberalism is the market will solve the problem. But we so misunderstand money and the constraints around money, and the relationship between money and the physical and the logistical side of life, that we just think, as long as it's profitable, it's good. That's the right answer. So of course we're gonna pump all the oil out of the ground, even if it causes the planet to warm up, because it's profitable. But obviously we're misunderstanding the physics, and we're misunderstanding the physical side of how how are the institutions of money and finance and profitability, and the belief that right thinking is, having to be profitable in a monetary sense. The money gives us the false impression of our relationship to physicality. We understand physicality differently when we think it's just all institutional money, and the rules around finance doing it. So in a way, it may sound, I'm not saying we're not looking at the physicality. We're looking at physicality the wrong way, and we're doing the science of the physical. That plays an important part in how we want to design our institutional reality just as much as the physical reality. We have to understand that relationship. Okay, let me move to Will.
Thanks for your wonderful presentation, Torrey. I have 2 quick points. You seem to have brought a brand new view in the economic thinking. How widespread is it? What percentage of economists would you say hold your view, and what percentage still go along, maintain the conventional conservative or liberal view, which yours is neither?
Yeah. Well,
how new are you? That's a more precise way of putting it.
I'm actually not that new. There was a big debate in the 19th century between what was called the German Historical School and then what in the later part of the 19th century became called the Marginal Revolution and the Neoclassical School, which was a combination of Austrian, Anglo-Saxon, and French and Italian.
Right.
Yeah.
If I were to say everything else is the conventional, what you study at university, what the government would present to us, that's on one side, and what you're presenting to us is on another. How would you break it down in percentage terms? Are you 5%, 10%, or 1%? Where are you?
I would say I'm I would say I'm around 20%.
That surprises me, because why I'm asking you that, people like myself years and years ago used to despair when the IMF or the World Bank would descend on usually certain types of countries. And the first thing they would do is say, cut services. But my understanding is that the wealth of these countries is in 2 elements, mainly in their services and their material production. And when they go and tell them cut services, right away they are reducing their ability to produce wealth. That didn't really make sense to me. What you're saying, the way you're presenting things, make far more sense. So I just want to, because I have another point to raise, so I just want to leave that and move on quickly. You can comment on that if you wish, but I'd like to move on.
Yeah, move on, please. That's
okay. My other point is this question of government borrowing.
Yeah.
Now, I might get into trouble for saying this, but if I were to put myself, say, in the position of a government minister of finance, and I was asked the question, what's the limit in borrowing? My layman or my response would probably be, I don't know, and I don't really care.
Yeah.
That might get me fired, but my position would be, I would borrow and I would monitor my borrowing incrementally. So I borrow, I see how things are trending. If I need to cut back, I cut back. If I need to borrow a bit more, I borrow a bit more. Yeah. And that's it. That would be my philosophy.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Would I do agree. And there's various schools. And we remember, first of all, the Fed, after the 2008 financial collapse, essentially did the borrowing. They bought all these just, underperforming loans and assets of banks, private Wall Street banks. They just told those banks, we're going to create reserves that you now have access to, and we'll take all those things off the books. So the Fed did the bargaining. That's one aspect. Another, there's a group of economists in the U.S. called there's a new kind of theory emerging, modern monetary theory, that is essentially describes what you just described, that there's sort of an unlimited amount, but it has to be monitored and seeing, each new borrowing and each new expenditure by the government has to be evaluated in terms of how effective it is in stimulating economic activity and growth. So.
Okay, thanks for all that. Questions answered, yes, thanks.
Okay. Oh, Earl is back again. Okay.
Sorry about that, Torrey. I just wanted to deal with a couple of issues that were raised by Julie and Frank. Julia was speaking in essence about the legitimacy of our institutions, and Frank added to that creativity and freedom. Where does that work in? And I was looking for a good example, and I think speed limits would be a nice example. They're very real, and the police department philosophy is it's a speed limit, not a speed suggestion, and they enforce it more or less legitimacy. If the speed limit is 100 and you're going 120, you're going to get a ticket. So as opposed to that, I would call that a legitimate use of the police institution to say there is a limit and we're enforcing that limit, whatever. As opposed to that, in Canada, we have a housing crisis. I think everyone agrees with that. And there's more land than people in Canada. So every aspect of the housing crisis is caused by government laws, by institutions that either aren't doing their job or who started doing a job that was good at one point and now they've gone way past their expiry date. A second example is wars. We've got a couple of wars in the world right now. The law of gravity doesn't require a nation state to go to war. And so it's all done by governments that make decisions allegedly on behalf of their citizens. A lot of people have died and a lot of nation states have been totally destroyed by wars. And I think those, without judging the cause of the war, I think that's institutional overreach. And that was my concern, that we have all of these institutions that are going 1,000 miles too far and producing disastrous results for the nation. And in the case of the housing crisis, I listened to politicians on both sides, and I can tell you with assurance that none of them are even coming close to the solutions to the problems. Thank you, Torrey.
Yeah. Well, just to comment on that, Earl, I agree with you. There's institutional overreach all over the place, different governments, different places in the world. But it doesn't mean we just get rid of the institutions. We can debate on how far or not they go. But for example, the housing crisis, you don't want to have a gas station built right next to, or a factory built right next to your house. We like zoning laws. You don't want to have substandard housing built. We have construction codes. You don't want to have brain surgeons practicing who've never been certified and never gone to school. Milton Friedman thought, oh, the market will sort it out. We don't need any laws like that. He really thought that. So the libertarians and the neoliberals who think, any form of law, even like lines on the highway to make sure cars are, any form of institutional law is a restriction of my natural freedom. It's just ridiculous, in my opinion. Yes, there's overreach. And I know there's a lot of, I don't like, but the point is there's a lot more freedom with law. There's an optimal level of freedom. Freedom gets maximized or optimized with some level of institutional structure and order. That's all my point. How far overreach? Yes, that's a big issue, and that's where engagement in the process, the democratic process.
Everything you've said is correct, unless you happen to be the homeless person.
Why I don't follow that. I mean,
Well,
yeah, I mean,
you wanted zoning regulations among other things for housing, and I agree with that completely. I want it too, because I'm comfortably housed, but there are homeless people who don't have houses, and they don't care if there's a gas station next door to their house if they had a house.
right, that's right. But I would also say a lot of the homeless comes from um, sort of price inflation and people falling off that the ability to have financial viability for one reason or another.
Absolutely.
That's another element to it's not just so I'll just leave it at that, I guess. So, but let me get to Howard as the next question.
I'm glad we're getting to politics. I was thinking of again, I suppose a number of thoughts. One is, how consensus realizes itself or not in policy, and what sort of forces are at play. I mean, there's Rousseau's general will, or some sense of the zeitgeist, I think that that Jen was alluding to. But there are real political mechanisms that determine how economies get shaped and how institutions get shaped. And I think we tend to, when we think about overreach, we tend to think of government overreach rather than market overreach or capital overreach. So there's a complex dynamic between capital and democracy, for one thing. So there are lots of ways to examine how laws come into being, whether it's every time we get a new set of tax laws, or every tax season, there's a series of political decisions behind those. So I think I can't remember who was talking about the mathematics and the material reality of economic production, but a huge part of economics, I think, is just the institutions by which opportunities, benefits, and burdens are distributed among members of society. So there's that pure productive element, and then there's that distributive element as well. And so, politics shape those institutions. Even in terms of limits of debt, we can see how one limit of individual debt might be, or someone's ability to just resort to exhaustive litigation and just outspend the other guy in the courtroom so that it's impossible for him to make his or her claim. So I think that there are power relations and power dynamics behind institutional reifications of reality, or transforming ideational stuff and interests into institutional and material mechanisms that affect people's lives. I guess one more thing you talked about, we don't have a market economy, we have a market society. And I think in the broad, one broad recognition of that, or challenge, or problem with that is, the tendency to see market value as ultimately human value, or limit our understanding of human value to market value on a number of fronts. So I wonder too whether maybe this is a final third point. I guess if you're talking about economics as an empirical science, I guess we tend to think of it as an objective science, or has that sort of fallen off the rails now, and we've come to recognize the institutional and political mechanisms and the levers of power that that guide economic objectives and even economics as a science. So there's values inherent in those fields of economic investigation, or what we various theories. I don't think the theories are value free in that way. I think they're also determined by fundamental values, and also by exercises of power, which think tanks get funded, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just a couple of comments on what you said, and is just, we confuse a lot of times objectivity with physical objectivity. But even in the physical sciences, like I say, there's paradigm shifts between different theories. So we don't really have absolute objectivity even in the physical sciences. obviously there's less, objectivity in the human sciences. So there's an issue there, but it's resolved again through sort of making consensus of what we're going to agree on what the institution is going to be about. And like you say, yes, power is all important, not only in setting up laws, but power in the marketplace. There's inequality in the marketplace by just the simple fact of monopolies and wealthier buyers and less wealthy buyers, and there are values even in economic action, not even market value versus intrinsic value, but how you honesty, not lying about your products, or cheating. There's values there, ethical values. So they all come into play, which those ethical moral issues and which is kind of also a power issue, is different, are new domains or new phenomena than the physical sciences.
But
So,
they impact material physical reality in
Sure.
very, very concrete ways.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Vasily. Vasily.
So first, there was a question about the limits in economy. So you answered this question. I just want to contribute a little bit to the answer. So I think the huge limit is climate.
Right.
So basically, we know influence of climate on economy. So climate is definitely the limit. Then demographics is definitely the limit. How much we can consume per capita depends on the population. And for example, the number of unemployment rate is also a huge limit. Like when unemployment rate is too high, government need to do something radically to change it. So it's also a certain limit. Like unemployment rate cannot be 25% in the country, for example. So this is such the limit. And less obvious is the cultures, for example. Like if you try to imply some economy to some country, it will not work because culture is not accepting this. So this is four like limits which I can myself just to add. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good.
I have a question myself. Like we were talking about social reality a lot in your presentation about consensus, but social reality and consensus very much formed by politicians, by sphere of politics. Law is given by politics. Consensus is defined by politicians, but you never mentioned this term. So my question is, you didn't mention because philosophy doesn't like to go in sphere of politics, or because you defined it by government, word of the government or something? Like you, in whole your presentation, the word politics was not mentioned. Is it for some reason or not?
No, I mean, there was, well, I guess there was a reason. I'm implying there's politics, especially institutional reality is created politically, and economy, and the great philosophers say, for example, Aristotle, politics was the ultimate ground. In fact, economy was achieved first, your household viability and, reproducibility of the household. Once you had that going, the next step in the higher order or the higher valuable activity is to participate in politics, which is, the public good. So no, I'm not saying politics should be absent. It's definitely, a part of the picture. Yeah. And you might even say, when I say, like Heraclitus, the soul is infinitely deep. It's sort of, once the biological needs are met, then there's like a deeper level, or you can call it a higher spiritual calling to do politics. Politics is kind of a spiritual thing, because you're no longer just about yourself, you're about the public good, you know. Yeah. Okay. John.
Yeah, hi, Torrey. Thanks very much for the great presentation. I think this has been discussed before, but we've got a couple minutes left, so I thought I would ask. You mentioned language, and I'm
Yeah.
always very intrigued by how language fits into all this. So, what's your opinion? Do you think it's possible to have thought without language? And conversely, since we have language, do you think it's possible to know whether it's possible to have thought without language?
Yeah, that's good. Second question is very good. Again, I made that distinction between sort of just general awareness, consciousness, and thinking. Thinking is kind of a subset of consciousness. So we can be aware, but not necessarily in linguistic thinking on one hand. And we can develop knowledge without language per se, but usually language, when we have to express knowledge or express or report a reality that we're concerned about, we start thinking not necessarily in language only. I've kind of kept my remarks to language, but there's sort of a super category to language called semiotics, which is thinking in signs. So language is kind of a sign, but even within language, you have signs that have different aspects to them, you know. So, but anyway, the answer is that a lot of sort of our basic thinking is in signs, not necessarily in language. But we see smoke over the horizon, and that's a sign that there's a fire over there. There's a wind vane pointing in a certain direction, and we know the wind is coming from that direction, not anywhere else. So we think in terms of signs, and from signs we start being intelligent. We intelligently interpret our signs to understand our reality. We can see somebody frowning and we know they're upset, a sign. So it's not necessarily just language, but we're in this semiotic, we have a semiotic consciousness.
Yeah, I guess the question is how do you define smoke and fire and frowning and all that kind of stuff without language? A sign, I suppose, would be a good answer to that.
Yeah. Okay. Are we running out of time, Ala? I just noticed
I believe so. So we only have Rick and George. And anyone else have a questions, please, we're gonna post it on YouTube in 1 week or 2. So please address the question, and we promise we're gonna answer you on YouTube channel. Thanks.
So shall I take these last 2 questions? And
yeah,
then...
just last 2, but maybe straight to the point, please.
Okay, yeah. Rick.
Yes, I'd just like to point out that it is very possible to think without language. I was raised on a farm. If you have ever raised pigs, they are extremely intelligent, and believe me, they think they're smart.
Yeah.
Even babies, before they acquire language, they're expressing their emotions. They're not talking, but they are making feelings known without language. They are communicating.
Yeah.
Me personally, I don't know about everybody else, but I do think in pictures a lot. I need to. If I can, if words work, sometimes if I'm trying to solve a problem, like I used to be a millwright, fixing machinery. And I would think in pictures of how to solve a problem. I didn't use words. That was my way.
Yeah.
And thanks again. It was a great talk tonight.
Thank you, Rick. My pleasure. Well, I think that completes our discussion. So I'll turn it back to you, Ala.
Thanks very much, Torrey, and all of you. That was a really insightful presentation and discussion.